Good morning, Tom Brown here reporting from Tromsø round 9 for the Wales team. First up, the ladies having a very successful tournament. They were pitted against Lithuania yesterday, a very, very strong outfit, and unfortunately the higher rated opponents managed to beat them 4-0 in the end, but again some good games there. Today I'd like to talk more about the Wales Open team who were playing Tunisia. Tunisia are ranked slightly higher than us. I think they're ranked about the late 80s, so 86, 87, and we're about 96. So it was a pretty equal game, and it transpired that was the story of the match in a way. All matches were very close, and results could have gone either way. First game, which is a game I'm going to show you on board one, was Richard Jones. He had a very, very tough opponent in Zoubaier and Amdouni, who was rated 2350. Richard had a pleasant position from the opening, and in the end his opponent made a mistake where it looked like at best he should have had a draw, so we're going to show that. Tim had a very tough game where his opponent sacrificed an exchange for compensation, and it was very unclear as to whether he did have adequate compensation or whether indeed Tim was better. Certainly worth checking out that game. In the end, Tim re-sacrificed back the exchange to get a level rook ending. It was a draw. So that was the first two games to finish. So we were there on 1.5 out of 2. But the final two games, again, David Sands defended fantastically for a large proportion of the game, and did perhaps have a little opportunity to gain the advantage just after the time control. But in the end, his resourceful opponent kept finding new opportunities, and David was forced to give up the exchange, and that ultimately cost us the game. And on board 4, Francis Rayner chose to play the Maroczy bind setup and had a very pleasant position against his opponent. A lot more space, and it looked like Black's pieces were a little discoordinated, and perhaps on the time control there was still a slight edge for White, but as the game evolved towards the ending, it looked like his opponent got the upper hand and eventually managed to win the critical pawn on d5, and White's position slowly started to fall apart from there. So in the end we actually lost 2.5, 1.5, which was pretty disappointing given where we were sort of halfway through the game and just looking at the positions on the board. But as we say, they're tough opponents, and it's continuing to play for the full time, trying to make as few errors as possible is the key. Anyway, the game I want to show you today is Richard's win with Black against his Tunisian opponent. Okay, so his opponent started with e4. Richard's now standard defence is the Petrov. So a way to avoid the Petrov, with Petrov, I'll just remind those who are not sure, is when you play something like knight f3 and you answer with knight f6. It's known to be very solid, and it's difficult for White to prove an advantage. So instead of playing knight f3, a less common move, but again does have some threats, is bishop c4. So knight f6, standard attacking the pawn. So it looks like the pawn is defended, but actually it is still takeable, because even though it looks like you're losing a piece, you can regain the piece by simply playing d5, forking the knight and bishop there. So let's go back to knight c3, knight e4. Instead of knight takes knight, queen h5 is played with the not too subtle threat of queen takes f7, which would knight d6 attacks the bishop and f7, bishop moves, developing move, knight f3, knight c6, so regains the pawn, but perhaps in not too favourable circumstances. If we take this position on the database, it's not considered particularly good for White. It's indeed, I think it only scores about 30% on my database, at least anyway. This is because you get this nice tempo move here, g6, forcing the not quite. So knight takes, attacking the queen, so takes queen f3, so castles and knight f5. The idea being simple plan for Black here. Knight can come to d4 and maybe win the bishop. d4 is not allowed. Notice this bishop is very poorly placed. There should be a nice diagonal for this bishop here. Already this position you could assess as slightly easier to play for Black, I believe. So rerouting of the knight White tries now. Bishop comes to the long diagonal to impede White's development. So developing moves, occupy the open file. Knight comes to g3 and knight to d4, attacking the queen and forking the bishop. So queen returns to its original square. Bishop drops back to a square where it's not going to be under attack in the future after perhaps a knight e4, which is indeed played. So Richard wins the bishop pair and then attacks the knight with bishop f5. So white reacts actively by playing bishop g5, forcing, well, not forcing, but f6 was played then, and the bishop retreats to e3, attacking the pawn on a7. So we get this sequence here. Then bishop takes knight, pawn takes knight, and instead of playing rook takes pawn, Richard prefers to play queen e7, attacking the pawn. White defends the pawn and b5, and here white plays quite an unusual move of rook a6, quite interesting idea, sort of attacking this weak pawn here, and perhaps there's some ideas, as we'll see in the game, with the rook, queen and rook perhaps coordinating. Perhaps it's more sensible just to have taken this pawn, and we don't know, something like queen takes pawn and maybe c3, and this is approximately equal for white there. Instead, going back to the game after rook a6, so Richard takes the pawn, but this allows the infiltration of the queen on d7. What Richard has to be careful of here is, if we let's play a nothing move, is this, I mean, this sort of plan. So if you just say, well, let's just say h5 as a new variation, is the idea of the rook to take the rook to take the pawn here, and all of a sudden you're going to have very big problems on your second rank. So rook e6 is primarily designed to keep this pawn protected, because if this pawn is unable to be captured, it's going to be more difficult for this rook to get into the game. So white plays bishop c5, probably with the idea of controlling the e7 square to stop and prevent the rook going there, but then this is easily answered with bishop f8. His opponent, Richard's opponent, returns the bishop, but maybe taking would have been a bit safer. So bishop comes back, and then Richard occupies the e file. His opponent plays c3 because the pawn on c2 was defending, and Richard now defends the pawn on c7. It's a very nice bishop, actually. Notice it coming towards the king there. So white reacts with this with g3. I mean, with g3 and so queen, and then queen d3 here, and b4 here. In relatively short, both players were in quite short of time, and Richard here, assessing his position, decided he would sacrifice the exchange by rook takes bishop to get a perpetual where the king cannot escape the checks. Another line, if Richard wanted to continue to play, would go something like f5 to try and dislodge the bishop on e3 by playing f4, and then a typical line may go rook takes a7, queen e4 to help support the pawn there, bishop so maybe, yeah, so let's say rook a6 attacking here, so and if we, so then we will play f4, bishop will come to d4, and we've got so we could play, we've attacked the queen, and we get this position where black is a pawn down, but will have good compensation. So maybe after something like f3, then the rook can come into e2. I mean, the computer assesses this as approximately equal, but as you can imagine, it's quite murky and it's very hard to be confident with these kind of lines. So Richard plays the more practical move, so we go back after b4 of actually sacrificing the exchange to get lots of checks against the white king. So the rook takes, pawn takes forced, queen takes e3, so king goes to g2, and Richard's simple idea was to play queen e4. So rook f3, no harm done yet by white, queen e2, rook f2, queen e4. Looks like a draw should be the fair result, but then inexplicably white tries to play for more, which by playing king h3. This move deserves a double question mark, since it basically there's no way now to prevent a significant loss of material. so long as black is able to find the correct response. Notice the king cannot move at all because the queen is covering the key squares around the king. So in order to prosecute the attack further, it makes sense to introduce the rook that is not doing very much at the moment, and it's quite helpfully shown with these arrows here what the plan is. So indeed, rook e5 was played with the idea of coming to h5. So this queen check is pretty harmless. Bishop can just block. And now we're threatening, well, we're threatening rook h5 checkmate. So something like queen takes pawn, rook h5, the only move would be to put the queen in the way, and then we can just take the queen. So instead, white tries the g4 sensible looking move, but after h5 again the same threats have now and still there. So queen d1 was played, and after pawn takes pawn check, queen takes pawn is not possible, because if queen takes pawn, at the very least you've got rook check here, king g3 forced, and rook g5 wins the queen. So that's not very attractive. So king g3, rook d5, nice move. The idea of coming to d3 in some lines. So white in the end decides he has nothing better than just to take here, allowing rook g5. This is pretty straightforward win from here. So rook a7 takes the pawn. I think white is perhaps could have resigned here, but again played a few more moves. Check, king h3, and after g4 check, king h3, g3. In fact, though, yeah, white resigned after g4 check because of the idea that king h3, which is forced, and g3 is picking up the rook since it's a discovered check on the king. So very nice controlled game by Richard there. Equalised out of the opening, and his opponent was unwilling to take the draw and suffered as a consequence. Unfortunately, we did lose in the end, but we've a good chance today against Cameroon, and if we were to win that, we'll be back to 50% for the tournament. Okay, so I'll be back tomorrow with that report on that game. Thank you, goodbye.